It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate being invited. My task is to describe some of the anxiety that we see in autism spectrum disorder. Allison mentioned treatment. I'll talk a little bit about treatment in the end, but really I wanted to convey not just what the experience is like, but what's the feeling like. So I hopefully have some slides that will do some of that for you. Anxiety is a very significant component of autism. Studies suggest that about 40% of people with autism also have formal anxiety disorders. And today we're going to talk about what does that feel like, what's some of the underlying neurobiology of it, and also just a bit about the treatment. So autism, as you know, is defined by social and communication impairments and restricted and repetitive behaviors. The diagnosis is made irrespective of the underlying cause and doesn't imply any specific biology. But we now know that there are many, many different kinds of autism, as large genetic studies teach us. And the reality is that even though there are many different presentations across different people, there are still some common underlying biological themes. And so one of the themes that seems to be emerging is that the brains of people with autism are simply wired differently. Genetic studies, work in animal model systems, work in human neuronal model systems, teaches us that the fundamental connections between nerve cells are disrupted in autism. The brain's plasticity is affected in such a way that it interferes with basic process of learning and memory from the earliest stages of development. Right? So what does it mean to feel anxious in autism? Right? What is that experience about? I really like this slide. So socially, right, we'll talk about a bunch of the different core symptoms, and I'll try to relate each of those to anxiety. I think actually if you think about all the core symptoms of anxiety, many of them, and most really, can be seen as either a cause or a consequence of anxiety. So socially, for example, people with autism, they don't process the world in the same way that we do, right? Really, the details of their environment are very, very overwhelming. So they have a lot of difficulty scanning their environment and extracting out what's socially salient. Even specifically as it regards faces, when people with autism look at faces, they don't activate a very specific part of the brain called the fusiform face perception area, whereas typically developing people do, right? So for people with autism, faces really hold no more emotional significance than objects do. And in fact, the part of the brain that they use to process faces is the same part of the brain that we use to process objects. It's interesting, right? Here, this sort of lateral section. So what ends up happening is they have to use this very kind of mechanical way to understand faces. They take apart the face and they use this very piecemeal processing. So they're looking at the eyes and the nose and the mouth, and they have to apply almost like an algorithm to pull it all together and understand that configuring your face in different ways actually reflects different underlying emotional states. Whereas for most of us, we have an intuitive understanding of what faces are supposed to look like and can pretty immediately recognize what the underlying emotional sense is. We use sort of a gestalt type of processing. But without that intuitive sense, faces are inherently very confusing. It's no wonder that one of the primary symptoms is avoidance of eye contact, right? So look at this face of Barack Obama, right? You can tell, of course, that it's his face, but the expression isn't totally obvious, right? You probably find yourself kind of looking at the eyes and the nose and the mouth. Your gestalt is essentially disrupted. And that's what it's like for people with autism. You turn the face upside down, and it's immediately obvious, right? But for people with autism, even right side up, they have to use this kind of individual processing of the details, and there's a delay in trying to understand what's going on and trying to figure out what the underlying emotional state is. So the same challenge that people with autism face in trying to process faces actually relates to the environment also. They get overwhelmed by details, right? They get very, very focused on parts of objects. Even this tree trunk, for example. It's this idea of essentially missing the forest for the trees. Right, now all of a sudden, things come into focus. But imagine walking around with those kinds of deficits, right? It creates a huge amount of tension for these folks and causes a lot of anxiety, right? I think the world in general, for them to process, takes a whole lot more time, and it's typically fraught with all kinds of errors in judgment, right? So we talked about social functioning, but what about language? Right? Language is this key social currency, and it's also impaired in autism. Similar to face processing, there are specific parts of the brain that are meant to process and also produce language, and this is impaired, and specific areas like Broca's area in the frontal lobe, there it is, doesn't activate properly in response to language and contributes to the challenges that people with autism face in the social world, right? So in general, effective communication and social skills are critical for adaptive functioning. Deficits in these areas create a huge amount of tension for people and contribute to lots of anxiety that they experience in their day-to-day. Oops, sorry. I'll go back for a second. So another way that people with autism deal with anxiety is through repetitive body movements, right? Also called these motor stereotypies. And so you see this kind of bouncing and this rocking and this pacing back and forth. These are really confusing movements because sometimes they're meant to soothe when anxious, but other times they can be meant to actually stimulate. Sometimes we just simply don't know the origin of these movements. But the pacing and the rocking and the jumping up and down, you can actually see it in all kinds of like ancient tribal dances or religious ceremonies. And so here you see a group of shaman from rural Nepal. And they're going into a trance, in essence, to try to rid themselves and their community of demons. Again, you can think about it a little bit as an internal reflection of anxiety. Perhaps these kinds of movements activate sort of primitive parts of our brain to trigger a soothing mechanism. It's fascinating. So some of us, we can soothe using our higher cognitive functioning, right, or thought. But sometimes we really just need like intense sensory input. It's the equivalent in some ways of a hug, right? So sensory sensitivity, that's the other symptom domain that I'll talk about in autism with respect to anxiety. Kids with autism, adults with autism, they have huge sensory sensitivities to all kinds of tactile, auditory, visual input. Walking into the room for them can be completely overwhelming because of the lights and the sound. They avoid things altogether. They cut tags out of the back of their shirts. I'm going to give you a kind of an intense slide, give you a sense of what this feels like. All right, cut the sound. Yeah. I had a digital media group create that. You can cut the sound, I think, just let the video run. Yeah, it's intense, right? It's extremely overwhelming. And that's, I think, what it feels like to have autism, right? And so what do you do when sensory stimuli overwhelm you? You try to avoid it, right? And that's what kids with autism do. They'll wear hats to shade the light. They'll cut the tags out of the back of their shirts. They'll isolate in the safety of their room. And they'll just avoid situations altogether. It's extremely overwhelming for them. In addition to this kind of chronic internal experience of anxiety, people with autism also meet criteria for distinct formal anxiety disorders based on diagnostic criteria. Meta-analyses that combine results, one meta-analysis in particular, that combined results from, I think, 31 studies with over 2,000 kids with autism, found that 40% met formal criteria for an anxiety disorder. This is a much higher percentage than you see in other kinds of conditions like ADHD or learning disabilities or intellectual disability without autism. But the most common anxiety disorder in autism is probably a specific phobia and occurs in about 30%. So specific phobias in autism are things like fears of loud noises like thunderstorms or lightning, fears of animals or fears of medical procedures like needles. Another common anxiety disorder in autism is obsessive compulsive disorder in about 17%, social phobia in about 17%, generalized anxiety disorder in about 15%, separation anxiety in about 9%, and then panic disorder in about 2%. But diagnosing anxiety in autism is actually very challenging because of the language deficits, the cognitive deficits, the difficulty these folks have in describing their emotions, and often the very kind of unique and confusing array of behavioral symptoms. Often caregivers and clinicians have to basically infer anxiety as the cause of a given behavior based on detailed functional behavioral analysis, trying to understand the triggers in the environment, the environmental cues, the whole sort of situation, and figuring this must be partly, at least, anxiety related. And so what is anxiety, right? At its core, it's a fear of losing control, right? And that's what these kids feel like. They're walking around the world and constantly feel this threat of being out of control. And as an aside, what do we tend to do when we're fearing losing control? We try to control our environments, right? We try to control our environments or other people. That's what kids with autism do. They'll try to force their parents to drive home in a certain way, or answer the same question over and over again, or not sit cross-legged, for example, right? They get obsessed with movies or TV shows, and they watch parts of those shows over and over again. But that kind of predictability, it provides like a comfort, a soothing almost, right? And knowing, for example, that a certain video game has rules, and if you follow the rules, you get specific rewards. All of that is extremely reassuring for people with autism. I think the other thing that people talk a lot about is the restricted and controlling eating habits. Even that can be a form of trying to control your environment and provide some structure to a world that generally feels unstructured to you. And that's why the routines are so important also. But my favorite, albeit somewhat disturbing story about dietary routines is a young man named Max. Max only ate 3 things. We'll call him Max. His name is not really Max. He ate 3 things. This is a true story. Steak and potatoes, frozen pizza, but it had to be a very specific brand of frozen pizza, and it had to be cooked in a very specific way, and then Peking duck. I tell this story because it always gets a laugh, but the Peking duck, it's true. Max would only eat Peking duck from a very specific restaurant in his town because he liked the way that they cooked it. One day there was a fire in this restaurant, and they had to close the kitchen down. It was a disaster for Max and his family. It led to tantrums, it led to aggression. They tried every restaurant in the entire area, but nobody cooked the Peking duck to Max's specifications. Eventually, the restaurant sort of restored its kitchen, and order was also restored to the family. But, yeah. So going back to these kind of discrete anxiety disorders, you know, even anxiety in and of itself can contribute to the social deficits and communication deficits that you see in autism, right? It can exacerbate the underlying problem to a large extent. Sleep, especially, right? If you have sleep disturbance, which would be caused by anxiety, you have mood changes, you have concentration problems, you have decreased energy. So again, it's this idea of seeing anxiety as kind of a cause or potentially a consequence of autism. For all these reasons, though, it's absolutely critical to treat anxiety and autism. So how do we do that? So there's actually an autism treatment network, and they formed an anxiety work group. They recently published a study that was a systematic review of all the pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments in anxiety. The results suggested modest benefit for the use of cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically to treat anxiety and autism, but really noted a lack of rigorous studies using pharmacological treatments. We know that pharmacological treatments are extremely effective for anxiety in typically developing people, including with serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac or Zoloft. But the results in autism actually are quite mixed, and there's a real lack of double-blind, placebo-controlled studies looking specifically at anxiety as a feature of autism. Despite that, though, I think most people would agree that there is some evidence to support the use of medicines that target the serotonin system to treat anxiety and autism. In terms of non-pharmacological treatments, most studies emphasize the need to adapt standard cognitive behavioral approaches to really accommodate the sort of different learning styles that kids with autism have. You know, the idea that you have to deliver information in a very concrete way to make sure these kids understand it. And adapting it also means using things like visual supports, written material, video modeling, that kind of stuff. Repetition, practice, those kinds of things are emphasized over and over again. And of course, sometimes special interests are incorporated into therapy. Oh, I'm flashing. Well, thank you. I'm really, that's good timing. I'm really pleased to have been able to talk about anxiety and autism. Thanks.